Hi there. I'm Alexandra Rahr. I'm the Bissell Hayde Lecturer in American Studies and an assistant professor teaching stream at the Center for the Study of the United States here at the University of Toronto's Munk School for Public Policy and Global Affairs. And that is a ridiculous mouthful, but I wanted to make sure to highlight my affiliation before I started talking to you today, because like many of you, I am not appointed in an environmental focused program. My job is in an environmental studies program. And so that means that I include environmental humanities content when and where I can. And today I'm going to talk to you about one of those when and where I can moments. Keeping in mind that this classroom experience that I'm describing wasn't part of a dedicated course on environmental history or environmental lit. It was instead a second year class, Intro to American Studies. We took a field trip to a skyscraper that was under construction and focused particularly on the development street level cladding, which for a couple of years brought a leafy, apparently realist, but actually fantastical forest to Canada's busiest street corner. So I'm going to begin by highlighting some American Studies connections, and I wanted to do this because this is what I did in the classroom, and this is how we situated this content and made connections to it so that the study of nature didn't end up being siloed in the way that environmental research sometimes is. So for the first few minutes, if you're wondering where is the ASLI content here, don't worry, I am getting to it. So I'm going to share my screen with you and get started. Okay, so in April 2017, developers broke ground on a new super tall skyscraper in Toronto, Canada, just a few blocks from where I live and work. At 94 stories high, the Highrise will, when completed, which is expected to be spring 2023, soar almost a quarter mile above the sidewalk. It will be the tallest residential building in Canada and the second highest building of any kind in the country, coming in just behind the CN Tower, which you can see here on the right in these artist renderings. In case you're wondering, the price for a unit here starts at 1.1 million and currently goes almost as high as the building itself to $29.9 million for a 6,500 square foot, 4-story penthouse. The estimated purchase price for the land, just the land, was $300 million. And the estimated cost for the project itself, for the development as a whole, is $1 billion. So really, this is just to say you can't talk about this text without talking about capital. So we got into that conversation the week before our site visit by focusing on two economic modes, luxury and romance. These themes are also tied into material we covered elsewhere in the course, particularly when we talked about plantation cultures, reparations, and the Pocahontas John Smith love story. A lot of this messaging is pretty transparent, as you'll see, and what we focused on in our conversation was the pervasive aesthetic of luxury. We talked and thought about luxury as one among many aesthetics, and especially we looked at what we can think of as minimalist-ish luxury, what Adam Phillips refers to as a terror of the vulgar. This is another artist rendering of what one unit might look like. As you know, these days, mid-modern style frequently signifies a kind of aesthetically restrained yet costly luxury. And you can see some of the mid-mod traits here: terrazzo floors, natural wood, clean lines, some floating furniture. So as Bourdieu reminds us, luxury signifies. Living here, the marketing suggests, is more than just an address. Living here makes you a particular kind of person. The kind of person who reads popular award-winning contemporary fiction, like The Goldfinch, Donna Tartt's book, which we see resting casually here on a nightstand underneath a Rolex watch. You will also listen to Nina Simone on vinyl. This specific detail really resonates with students, and it allowed us to touch on Carmen Van Kerkhove's definition of hipster racism, as well as Talia Mear's work on hipster exceptionalism, both of which look at the appropriation and deracination of Black art by white consumers. So in addition to these notes on luxury consumption, we also looked at why in the world a high-rise is being marketed as a love story. This building has a name. It's called The One, which is a play on its address at 1 Bloor Street West, but also, of course, an echo of star-crossed romance. It suggests that this building is the one, just as the beloved is, destined happily ever after, the end of the story. In this case, the singular place where your dreams will come true, just as in the heteronormative binary that is so foundational to romance, there's a singular person with whom your dreams will come true. And the developer, Sam Mizrahi, echoed this kind of singularity of the romance when he said of the building's name, excuse the pun, but there's really only one building like this. This building has zero compromises, and that's why it is what it is. So these romantic tropes have been really deftly mapped, as I'm sure you'll know, by scholars, including, to name just a couple, Janet Radway and Deborah Chappell. One more example of the built environment romance. The latest price list for the condos is printed on this letterhead. The one has no rival, it's matchless, which is another way, of course, of saying it's the tallest of the tall, dark, handsome strangers. So that's the broad context, the specs, as builders say, and some of the American Studies themes that we connected that run through the course and resonate with the one. And now to the text itself. Like so many other high-rise developments in recent years, the fencing around this construction site is also a visual installation. Until earlier this year, the one's cladding was covered in a photorealist forest, lush, green, lofty, rising from the sidewalks to high above the heads of those ambling or rushing by. We walked to on our walk to the building, we talked about hoarding. Hoarding of this kind is generally confined to urban and commercial spaces. As you can see, you don't usually see hoarding outside of an individual home's reno. We walked by a house in the midst of a major reno, as well as other commercial buildings, which use hoarding or cladding in more traditional ways, just as an advertising surface for the building or for the developer itself. Here's an example from somewhere that's not Toronto, and here's a Toronto example. One thing that really caught the class's eye about hoarding is that it's a cover-up, right? An explicit cover-up, a security apparatus that's masquerading as a forest. And a couple of instantiations of, just gonna stop my share for a sec, a couple of instantiations of security in this context. Hoarding is, of course, another way of saying fence, and fences have two sides, as Woody Guthrie reminds us in that not too frequently sung verse of This Land Is Your Land. The fence can give a measure of safety for pedestrians passing within just a few feet of massive building projects. But the structure really exists to fence things in. And more conceptually, hoarding mimics and enacts that soon to be that under construction border between private and public space. It reminds us that the previously empty lot is owned and that vacant or under construction space is not public space. So regimes of privacy, right, both personal privacy and private property are at work here, as another of the very teachable aspects of this text makes clear. So the one, like many commercial construction sites, has windows in its hoarding so that passersby can see in. Some of them are pretty basic, like this one. And they're explicitly designed to satisfy curiosity, right? To prevent you from climbing over to see what's behind that fence. As part of their participation grades for the week, students collected images of creative uses of hoarding. And I want to show you a couple of those examples of self-aware hoarding with peepholes, which highlight the peep show nature of these windows. This is a great one. So these examples really foreground the act of seeing and treat the passersby as a spectator, really as flaneur. And we reflected while we were visiting the site on the illicit and transgressive potential of the flaneur, about which, of course, queer studies has had much to say. Urban spaces are so often depicted and experienced as environments of liberation, only for particular subjects, of course, but they're often imagined for those particular privileged subjects as zones of escape, right? Escape from strictures, whether those strictures are economic or moral or cultural. And this logic, I think really importantly, echoes with how forests are also imagined, right? As zones of escape. So one of the things I wanted our visit to do was to really spotlight the tension between that kind of freedom and the prohibitions which can pass unnoticed in city life, such as how in putatively public spaces, sightlines and property lines are often mapped onto one another. So to the hoarding at the One. We got there, we sort of oriented ourselves, split up for a few minutes so we could walk around and reflect and think about what we saw. And then we met back across the street where we could have a longer conversation before returning to campus. So the big question that structured our conversation: why is a $1 billion downtown condo development in one of the continent's largest cities wrapping itself in the romance of the forest? And the inevitable pedagogical follow-up, what is the effect, right? What does this literal greenwashing do? So I want to talk to you about some of what the students had to say, some of what arose from our visit. Right off the bat, the forest Instagram aesthetic really was recognizable to students. And we talked about just what that style is and what it does. So they noted that it's hyper-verdant and intimately close up, and thus immerses passersby, that it is photorealist, and because it's photorealist and not, say, a watercolor or plainly fantastical, that it is meant to seem real. All we see here in the hoarding is trees, and more specifically, particular trees and particular parts of those trees. There is no wide open sky here. There's no horizon, no forest floor. There are no people, there are no pathways, there are no buildings, there's no more than human life. Not even any other varietal of tree, as one environmental science student noted. This is a monocrop, not an ecosphere. We also talked about positionality. The hoarding really suspends viewers, as you can see in this image, in the middle scale of forest. Right? We're looking at the canopy, but we're not looking up at the canopy. Our necks are not craned back. Instead, as we walk, we are placed in midair. Our point of view here is really with the absented birds, looking straight ahead at all those green leaves. And indeed, leaves and trunks are all we're permitted to see. We're earthbound as we walk by or wait for the light to change. But nevertheless, the hoarding liberates us from gravity and lifts us off our feet, right? So it's quite literally an elevating experience, which of course echoes with all of the rhetoric about the tallest building. So this is to say we are untethered. The forest is hyper-realistic in its close-up focus on one species and absolutely fantastical in its exclusion of everything else. As one student put it really pithily, this looks like nonfiction, but it's actually a fairy tale. So the class was really intrigued by the use of a realist mode and realist colorway, the apparent verisimilitude, and in the unreal elements that unfold when you pay attention to that mimetic act. And this tension really allowed us to discuss, in that inevitable environmental humanities conversation, what is natural and what is unnatural about so-called nature. This was the way that we got to enter into thinking about how the West's imagination of nature was really formed and is still formed as a reaction against technomodernity. And that tied into a later section we did on national parks. Okay, one other point, students also delved further into what we could think of as viewing protocols. What happens when we stop and look at something which is specifically designed to be seen only in glimpses? We talked about how the built environment teaches us to read it and not to read it as well, about visual literacy and illiteracy of walking down a city street. Walt Whitman is a great supplementary text here, you will not be surprised to hear. So the question of where our gaze rests and where it does not, for instance, on a forest and not on the construction site behind it. I also like the way that the hoarding places the class firmly in the forest and also moves it beyond the forest. We know that the field of environmental humanities, from its beginning interest in nature writing, has developed another interest in eco-criticism and environmental justice in recent years. And the hoarding really works for all of these modes. First of all, it allowed us to talk about the forest imaginary as detached from actual woodlands, right? The forest as traditional escape, as I mentioned earlier, refuge from the strains of modern life. And we were able to talk about how the hoarding evoked those lineages, as well as the urban park and city beautiful movements. This also allowed us to foreground how academic disciplines shift, right? This is the Teaching the Conflict School of Pedagogy, so that we could talk about environmental humanities' interest in nature writing, as well as its interest in, for instance, petrocultures and environmental justice. So one mode of the forest that I want to close with that is excluded from the hoarding, and a number of students noticed this, that's the eco-Gothic, right? Which imagines the woods as deep, dark, and dangerous, as Elizabeth Parker puts it in her recent book on the subject. So the One's forest is absolutely all sunlit youth. The installation captures a woodland at the height of summer and the heat of day, featuring bright green deciduous growth, not deep evergreens. And it really matters, right, that these are leaves and not needles. There are no signs of shadow or even encroaching autumn in this image. Another student asked, picking up on the fairy tale theme, if this is a forest, are we Hansel and Gretel? Who's the witch? And in doing so, I think she really briskly summarized the moral economies of landscapes. She was right, of course. This site belies, in reality, this site belies the bright-faced safety that is featured on the hoarding. The other side of the forest, the other side really of the plywood, is much more hazardous. Just a few months ago, The Atlantic ran a piece on the dangers of high-rise construction work, and we didn't read this one at the time. We visited before the pandemic, visited the site. However, we did read work similar to this. And in 2017, 18 construction workers died on the job in Ontario. More recently, 30% of opioid deaths in the province, among the province's employed people, were in the construction industry alone, an industry, of course, with high rates of injury and resulting pain medication prescriptions. Just a few months ago, the One took down its woodland cladding and replaced it with oversized black and white photos of the construction site itself and of its workers. Here's what those look like. So the people building the One, people we were just talking about, are now featured on its hoarding, and they have replaced the verdant young forest. This is one way that looking at the hoarding and its woodland opens up eco-critical and justice issues. Disposability politics and the long history of labor endangerment is absolutely intimately tied, as we know, to resource extraction. But downstream work like construction is often divorced from these processes. So we talked about the relationship between the trees which grace the hoarding and the timber used to build the One and its mid-century modern cabinets and hardwood floors, all of course elided by the hoarding's wordless celebration of nature. So I have been thinking about this paper as a hallway that we could walk down together and gesture at doors we didn't quite have time to walk through. These are some of the doors we walked through and explored in this kind of experimental moment in teaching. So thank you so much for tuning in. I'm really looking forward to hearing what questions you have and what my fellow panelists have to say about their teaching practices. And especially, I wanted to say that I am so looking forward to meeting in person when ASLE reconvenes offline, and we can finally talk and learn and maybe even sing together. So thank you so much.